Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Planting Hope by Jennifer Rains, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Holly's head was cobwebbed with sleep. Only the dream of coffee lured her from her sleeping bag. The barista-cum-chef in charge of the breakfast tent at the quaintly named Buroa Music Festival had her double-shot, flat, white coffee in his hand when she reached the counter. "Oh, you're a lifesaver, Pedro." Almost grazing her nose against the rim of the cup, she absorbed the scent of a fresh brew. "And a master of the bean." "Food?" The talented volunteer. Pedro grinned at her ritual, his wink a promise he'd reserved a warm bread roll and banana for her. At her nod, he handed them over. "Thanks." Senior medic at the 3-day festival, Holly had been ministering to party-hardened fans at 4:45 this morning. She'd welcomed the security backup when the final patient, a boozy bruiser with a stubbed toe, had wanted to hang around. "You're the last crew in," Pedro returned to tending the bubbly pot on his stove, the ingredients in the Thai pumpkin soup, a delicate, spicy backbeat to his sweet Arabica bean brew. He flipped his sound system to maximum decibel, heavy metal band, AC/DC. Holly winced, whispering to herself, "You'll be deaf by 30. The distorted guitars were a shocking contrast to the cruisy folk that had headlined the regional festival. Ear-shattering rather than loud was Holly's verdict, permissible only because the bulk of the 5,000 fans had broken camp overnight and not so silently departed. Dusty, desolate fields with blue portable toilets extending in forlorn lines testified to a near-empty campsite. Taking a table at the side, she let the first sip of coffee work its magic on her body and brain. She moaned. A caffeine dependency was borderline mandatory when sleep deprivation topped the risk list in your job description. Holly offered thanks to all the gods in the universe, took another sip, and closed her eyes to savor the hum of well-being stretching to her toes. Humanity's continuum of vice included infidelity and murder. Caffeine addiction was the smallest sin, a vice she'd keep. She dunked a hunk of bread in her coffee, watching as the dough absorbed the liquid. When it was close to disintegrating in her fingers, she popped it into her mouth. Maybe that counted as another vice. "My last shift for this festival." Her gut tightened. 8 months since her last nursing shift on emergency surgery. 10 years in nursing, the last 2 in emergency at Brisbane's Princess Alexandra Hospital. Drawing in a deep breath, she then exhaled on a count from 8 to 0 as she'd been taught, consciously blocking out the memory of Donna's murder in a workplace dedicated to healing. Here and now. Here and now. When her wandering gaze met the barista's, he held out an empty cup in one hand while pointing at it with his other. She nodded. A few minutes later, he leaned over the table with her coffee, the deliberate stretch lifting his blinding white t-shirt, giving her an eyeful of toned, tanned abs. "Thanks." She pretended not to get his "I'm available" message, just as she had every morning, instead returning a friendly smile. Pedro was tasty, all solid muscle and lean length, and her pulse remained disappointing rock steady. Her nostrils quivered as she inhaled her second coffee. "Are you shutting up shop soon?" she asked as he lingered. "Some of the organizers and crew won't finish till late today. I'll go tomorrow." He shrugged, and she guessed more than heard his words. "What about you?" "A few hours stock taking medical supplies, then I'll be on my way." Her best friend's death, even the conviction of Donna's killer, had left Holly untethered, seeking something she couldn't define. Closure? Peace? She was managing, if running on the spot could be called managing. She took enough paid nursing shifts at the music festivals she followed down the Australian eastern seaboard to keep her bank account positive, socialized with other crew members, but she no longer had a sense of who or what she'd be for the rest of her life. "It's been a pleasure, Holly." He blew her a kiss as he backed away. "Maybe next time." He waggled his eyebrows suggestively. She toasted him with her mug, a pathetic indictment of her state of mind when coffee held more appeal than sampling a warm, willing Pedro. Gorgeous hunks were a fixture at music festivals, and she'd originally planned to reject the caution of a lifetime to celebrate the fact she was still alive with occasional quick tumbles with relative strangers. Donna's go-girl rang in her ears. Only Holly hadn't been tempted. Not once in her 6 months on the road. Her heart was numb. Hell, her sex drive was numb. Not a single man had made her gonads go pitty-pat or eased her aching sense of failure. Her phone, tucked in her overalls pocket, vibrated against her leg. An unknown number. Hello, Holly here. Unable to hear above the music, she raised her voice. Hold on. Lifting the phone high enough for Pedro to see, she pointed at it, then gave him a thumbs up when he hit the volume button. Her ears still ringing, she tried again. Holly here. Holly Cooper? The husky emphasis revealed the man's frustration at the delay. Can I help you? Your grandmother, Mona Cooper's in hospital. Heart, she croaked, pressing a hand to her own. Had Mona lied about the seriousness of her heart condition? Holly blinked. The tent still held a scatter of people. She read normality, decency, cooperation, values her grandmother had taught her to appreciate. The independent old matriarch hated admitting to physical weakness, any weakness. Oh, please tell me she's okay. Holly offered a silent prayer. Damage to soft tissue and exposure. Exposure? Holly fastened on the impossible word, her mind reeling. He wasn't making sense. They'd screen timed about her gardening as healing project for 8 primary school kids. An earthquake wouldn't have budged Mona from her 5-acre property in temperate Melbourne, rural Victoria. How the hell? A fall in her garden, spent the night there. The man cut her short, her mental speculation. Which hospital? I need to be there. Bendigo. You're a nurse, damn it, Holly. Pull yourself together. Images of the Brisbane emergency ward of a knife-wielding assailant and of Donna dying at her feet hit her like a tsunami, tumbling her into a rolling swell. Fear for her grandmother paralyzed her. Emergency admission about 9 this morning, the man added, as if she should have asked him for details. And she would have asked, but he was talking about Mona. Mona was supposed to live forever. Mona the Invincible, the name Holly had coined for her as a child. 75 wasn't old, but old enough with a heart condition to make being exposed to an early spring Victorian night potentially deadly. She swallowed, her throat parched. Did she ask for me? Helplessness, a constant companion since Donna's death, shredded Holly's confidence her intervention could make a difference in an emergency. I haven't been able to speak to her since I found her. He wasn't a doctor then. A neighbor, perhaps? Holly didn't know all the neighbors, but learning Mona wasn't completely alone settled her deepest fears. Oh, why? She messaged her left temple where a throbbing headache threatened. At first, she was drifting in and out of consciousness. Now she's sleeping. The image of an unconscious Mona stopped Holly's heart. I rang your father. He said you were closer. His growl was a grating mixture of impatience and disgust. Holly shared his impatience. I have to be there now. Maybe he'd misunderstood her father's deferral to her. She was closer in distance, closer in spirit. Her father trusted her to get there as fast as she could, faster than he could. I'm on my way. She started a mental list, apologized to the organizers, hand over the medical inventory to a colleague, pack her gear, then retrace the 20 kilometers of dirt road to the highway before tackling the 500-odd kilometer drive to Bendigo. I'll be there as soon as I can. I wouldn't want you to put yourself out. Flint, hitting cold steel, couldn't have been sharper. The man was seriously irked, and her failure to estimate an arrival time probably pissed him off further. She shuffled names in her head. She had a contact at the hospital, could get a professional update as soon as she got this grumpy Samaritan off the phone. What's your name? Christopher Silverton. Thanks for letting me know about Mona, Mr. Silverton. Holly approached the hospital entrance, her chokehold on her bag, bringing an unwelcome insight. 6 months away, in the sense she was no longer safe in a hospital, lingered. She wasn't ready to return to emergency work. Still, she hadn't known her stomach would heave like the deck of the Titanic at the thought of entering any hospital. Flashing lights and a siren signaled the imminent arrival of an ambulance. Sweat trickled down her spine. Balking at the hospital door, she glanced around to check for witnesses to her mini panic attack. 8, 7, 6, 5. She counted backward to 0, then did it again and again before she was steady enough to cross the threshold. She also thought she was prepared for how frail Mona would look, but her heart stumbled at the stillness of the tiny body tucked beneath the blindingly white hospital sheets in the private room. The corners of the bed were neatly tucked. A trivial detail for her to notice, but attention to detail showed someone cared. After brushing away her tears, she donned a hospital gown over her grubby clothes before approaching the bed. You're here, Mona whispered, her hand turning in Holly's. Mona, conscious and aware, banished some of the scariest scenarios her mind had conjured while counting down the kilometers on the endless punishing drive. For as long as you need me. I'm sorry I scared you. I don't scare that easily. Holly flashed her brightest smile, but fear of what she'd find had kept her mind sharp and her muscles tense. Lives could be changed forever in an instant. It can't stop now. What can't stop? The project, I was right, Mona's whisper was part plea. Creating a garden that can help children heal. The project can't stop because I'm in hospital. It won't stop. Holly's promise was a solemn vow. Holly couldn't remember a time when Mona hadn't plotted for this project. From a distance, Holly had been party to every application, every knockback, every painstaking effort over years to get the education, health, and juvenile justice authorities on side for her Gardening is Healing pilot project for children who'd witnessed or been victims of domestic violence. Mona's delight had reverberated down the phone line when she won the 6-month grant to fund it. Any threat to the project was a threat to Mona's recovery. Go home now, darling. I knew you'd come. Mona closed her eyes on a sigh. Holly's contact at the hospital had finished for the day, but the duty intern and her own check of the charts confirmed Mona was stable, medicated, and under observation. She updated her father before leaving the hospital. Drawing to a halt in Mona's driveway, she rested her head on the steering wheel. She was beyond tired, and with the adrenaline draining from her body, every muscle and bone ached. She hauled her rucksack from the back of the van she'd named Norman. Expecting to detour to Mona's on her journey south, she'd packed her own keys, a mismatched set of 6. Her fingers moved over the metal surfaces in the half-dark of the star-filled night, finding the right one for the front door. The door gave as easily as ever, and the old-fashioned light shade bathed the hallway within a warm glow. She inhaled comfort and reassurance along with the heady scent of the yellow roses spilling over the sides of the crystal vase on the hall table, and breathed out some of her body's stiffness. The smell of beeswax sat behind the delicate perfume of the roses, Mona's preferred polish for the wide cypress pine boards. Roses, beeswax, and a hint of lavender. Holly's first lesson in natural remedies. A few drops of lavender oil in floor or furniture polish helped keep fleas under control. There was always the risk of fleas because there were always animals. Bella! Mona's golden Labrador should have barreled down the hall to greet her, just desperate for food as well as affection at this hour. Holly walked through rooms, flicking on lights. Finding them empty, she quickened her steps. Bella? She called again. Max! She pushed open the back door. The old cat had still been alive when she chatted to Mona, although the vet didn't give the ancient feline more than a few more weeks to live. Mona's voice had wobbled in the telling. Holly was a few steps into the garden, her gaze straining against new and unfamiliar shapes when the doorbell rang. Small country town. My neighbor must have seen the lights. She laughed at her jumpiness, but her steps slowed as she headed down the hall. The shadowy figure on the other side of the half-glass door filled the space. Over 6 feet and broad didn't match any of the neighbors Holly remembered. A flicker of alarm blindsided her. Donna's killer had been big. The Westminster chimes rang through the house again, and Bella barked. Whoever was on the other side of the door had Mona's animals. Holly flung it open and was knocked off her feet by the enthusiastic dog. She sprawled on the floor, the dog straddling her, her long tongue lapping at Holly's chin. Down, Bella, darling, she crooned, her fingers finding the magic spot on Bella's stomach. The dog rolled over in delight. You know the dog. Holly recognized the voice of her caller from earlier in the day. Her gaze traveled up long legs and paused at the work-roughened hand, holding the large cat basket where Max peered regally through the mesh. Continuing up, she found a broad chest covered in a navy sweater knitted in an intricate pattern Mona reserved for those she was fond of. Holly's stare landed on a craggy, square-jawed face scowling at her. His frosty gray gaze suggested his mood hadn't improved. How come Mona didn't mention her ripped mid-30s friend? Christopher Silverton. She scrambled to her feet and offered a hand. I'm guessing you looked after Bella and Max as well as Mona. He refused her offer of a hand, instead doing his own slow survey. She failed whatever test he'd set her. I've driven past the house a few times today, he said, but you weren't here. Just got here, she replied. The guy had needed a personality bypass, but he'd done his second good deed for the day. It's after 9. Is it? Could be a hair past a freckle for all Holly cared. She held out her hand. Max? I fed them. He handed her the carrier. I'll take you to the hospital. Her eyebrows rose at the masterful tone. That's not necessary. The least you can do is go and see your grandmother, or, he leaned closer and his nostrils twitched, maybe you need a bath first. Advice noted. She set the carrier on the floor, then closed the door in his face, deliberately locking it. She braced herself, body and mind, for a pushback, expecting his pent-up irritation to explode in loud knocking or shouted instructions. Nursing had taught her a lot of men didn't take no for an answer. Her heart skittered against her chest. A lot of people didn't take no for an answer. Endless microseconds later, he turned on his heel and walked away. At the sound of his vehicle backing out of the driveway, she released her breath to the count of 8. Phew! A gentle giant. Christopher, Kit Silverton, spotted Holly's van in the hospital car park the next morning. He'd have picked the battered vehicle as hers even without the interstate plates. The profusion of what looked like opium poppies spray-painted across one side made its own self-indulgent statement. He grunted, frustration leaving an itch between his shoulder blades. He'd driven past the house this morning, prepared to offer her another lift because, whatever his opinion, Mona loved her. And he'd fallen hook, line, and sinker for the feisty old lady since she'd invited him to co-manage her gardening as healing project 6 months ago. Shoot, he corrected himself. To his mind, Holly ranked lower than a stink beetle for using her grandmother as her bank. For fuck's sake, she's still following a hippie lifestyle at 20-something. And that's 2 gold coins in the swearing jar. To a disinterested observer, hiring Kit made sense. He owned and operated the town's only gardening supplies and landscaping business. But Mona had known his foster father, known his real father was a murderer, and known he'd come from the same desolate place as the kids on her project. Had probably also known she was throwing him a lifeline. Mona seemed to make a habit of rescuing people. He stomped through the front doors of the hospital, annoyed with himself and Holly. He didn't know for a fact she'd never worked, but hell, in the 6 months he'd worked closely with Mona, her granddaughter had crisscrossed the country, a camp follower for musos. Except the camp follower beat me here this morning. Kit had been ungracious when he'd met her, but he hated being helpless. Mona had slipped into unconsciousness shortly after he'd found her. The duty doctor had taken charge while Kit had started tracking down her next of kin. By the time Holly had picked up the call, his patience with a slow-to-respond family was exhausted. I'll be there, she'd said. The hours had dragged on, dappled sunlight had faded into night, and those 3 imprecise words were all he'd had. He'd driven himself crazy second-guessing her arrival time and had tried without luck to reach her again. Then he'd paced, trying to outdistance the guilt of not leaving Mona's garden secure. He'd only left Mona's bedside when the doctor had advised she was stable, and because he'd known her first question would be about her animals. Finding no one in sight at the second-floor reception desk, Kit headed down the corridor to Mona's room. A musical laugh floated through her open door. I'm surprised some of my campsite aroma doesn't still linger. I gowned up last night to prevent contamination, Holly gurgled. She'd visited last night, presumably before I met her. She'd let him make a fool of himself. The irritation flared again. She'd also shut the door in his face. He pushed this one wide in time to see Holly's Juno-esque form bent over Mona, her fingers combing gently through the gray hair, her ginger brown eyes filled with tenderness. No one had looked at Kit with such open adoration since his 8th birthday. The sense he was trespassing on an intensely private moment hit like a belly punch. She glanced up. Mr. Silverton. Her gaze danced mockingly, her pink and green cropped hair a neat, glossy cap on her skull, where last night it had stuck up as if she'd been trying to pull it out by the roots. The clothes were an improvement as well. The paint-splattered shirt and scruffy jeans were clean, unlike last night's overalls and purple sweatshirt. Ms. Cooper? He looked from her to Mona, moving to the side of the bed with his hand outstretched. I'm sorry. Mona took his hand, the light squeeze a poor substitute for her usual robust handshake, and guilt jabbed at him again. Not your fault, she whispered. I found you on the ground near a new ditch. The memory of her crumpled, motionless body brought Kit out in a cold sweat. There was a mattock nearby and no fencing to show the hole. I remember I tripped, Mona said slowly, then I couldn't get up. You fell heavily, bumped your head on the mattock, and passed out, he stated grimly. A mattock was a dangerous tool at any time, a mighty double-headed implement with its axe blade and cutting edge. Leaving it outside overnight was dangerously negligent. My fault the gear wasn't put away. Why is it your fault? Holly's brow puckered. I'm Mona's gardener on the project, although her passion for the kids had infected him until finishing the project had become his goal as well. More than a gardener, Kit, Mona protested. Christopher, Kit, Mona's talked about you. Now I know who you are. Holly's brow cleared. She cocked her head to one side and her eyes lit with interest. Darkness threatened to swallow him. She couldn't know his father had killed his mother when Kit was 8 years old. Mona wouldn't have shared his past without his permission. He threaded his fingers through Mona's. What were you doing in the yard after dark? Holding her hand soothed him. Looking for Max, Mona replied. Damn cat, Holly uttered the expletive. He waited for Mona's usual ferocious set down to anyone criticizing her beloved companion of 20 years. When no defense came, he gave his own. She and Bella were standing guard when I found Mona. The warmth from Bella, stretched full length, had prevented hypothermia, if you believe the duty doctor. Kit planned to supply top-of-the-range crunchies for both animals for the rest of their lives. Cupboard, love, Holly said matter-of-factly. Probably wanted breakfast. About to protest again, he saw the smile curving Mona's mouth. Mona was lapping up her granddaughter's silliness. Holly, go lightly, Mona called her. Audrey Hepburn might have made the character glamorous on the movie screen, but the go lightly girl hadn't been a stayer. Postcards arrived irregularly from this Holly, stamped from different towns. Great scones and scone, tempted by a saddle in Tenterfield, all of them signed H.G. She wore the Go Lightly nickname as a badge of honor, a charming, careless ne'er-do-well, heedless of responsibility, and prepared to let her grandmother subsidize her lifestyle. For Mona, he swallowed his disapproval. Speaking of which, Holly said, I'd best get some breakfast myself. Let you two discuss business. The vagabond blew a kiss on her way through the door. She had Mona's eyes. He'd seen photos of her around the house, easy on the eye, appealing rather than beautiful until you learned enough to make you wary. Her eyes were a surprise, the same shape, the same color as Mona's. Finding she had Mona's clear, direct gaze was an unwelcome distraction. And she smelled of honeysuckle. Spotting a minibus in Mona's driveway, Holly parked Norman in the empty street, folded her hands on the steering wheel, and rested her chin on them. Game on. The minibus testified to kids in Mona's backyard. Holly had coaxed names and physical description of the 8 kids in Mona's care from her before Kit's arrival. Staying until Mona was completely fit was a no-brainer. She'd promised. Negotiating with the censorious Mr. Silverton might be trickier. The man didn't like her. His problem, and she wasn't looking for a friend. But she'd have to learn enough about the project so she didn't step on anyone's toes in the short time she'd be here. Given he was now the boss, she'd have to deal with Kit Silverton. She pushed herself out of the van. Her first task was making the calls to cancel her music festival jobs for the next fortnight. The noise of the argument hit Holly first. She rounded the back of the house. Bedlam rolled. 8 children between the ages of 8 and 12, although the blonde-haired girl, Fairy, sitting in the mud looked younger, and 2 adult women all talking at once and waving their arms in all directions. Stay the fuck away from me, a scrawny boy knee-deep in mud shouted. Silence fell.